Good day, good evening to everyone who's joining in from wherever you are in this world today. Day one of Adobe Data World, and I hope all of you had an enjoyable learning experience through the day, inspired by perspectives, I'm sure, from so many different speakers and experts in their field. I had the pleasure of just joining in the previous session. I'm sure it was a pretty deep session as well, so very good. And to close out the day today, I think we are probably towards the latter half of the session. We are from Cognizant. We'd like to tell you a quick story about how do we manage change and how do we manage resistance to data adoption. Very honestly, as Stefan just said, this is quite relevant in our field as well. Not too many people expect, or not too many people understand why and how data is needed, except specifically in the exec leadership and so on. And sometimes you need to put the case forward to our execs and leadership, and how we put that forward is important. And we hope to give you a story that gives you some tips towards that. But anyway, before all that, let's introduce ourselves. My name is Karthik Padmanabhan. Stefan just said, call me KP, it's much easier. I actually have a consulting background. Early part of my career was process-oriented, process management and so on, but moved towards digital strategy, customer experience, especially in the last 10 to 12 years. Over the last decade, I've spent some time in the UK initially and some time in Australia, speaking to a lot of clients on their digital and experience journeys. Today, however, I'm based in India. I live in Chennai. I lead global delivery for Cognizant Digital Experience Services. It's a portfolio that spans experience design, marketing, content, and digital learning. The expert, however, in this particular field, and who your key speaker today, or the main speaker today, is Suranjana. So the expert in digital learning is my colleague Suranjana, who I'd invite next to introduce herself. Over to you, Suranjana. Quickly introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, KP, and thanks everyone for joining in today. My name is Suranjana Das Gupta. I'm based out of India in Calcutta. I am the Global Delivery and Competency Lead for the Digital Learning team at Cognizant. I actually started my career as a technical writer, and I've always been associated with content. So whether it was the technical content, the digital content, or the learning content. And as part of, in my professional journey, I've helped clients with large content transformation projects, bringing in process efficiency, helping implement digital strategies, and definitely improve the quality of the content that they have. I'll just quickly move on to the agenda and what we want to take you through. So as part of this presentation, by virtue of this presentation that we are doing today, we want to take you through the success story of being in the journey of implementing DITA for one of our strategic clients. So we just spend a quick few minutes on the group that both KP and I belong to, and then we'll actually get into the problem statement that we heard from our client, the quandary that they were in, and what we did to uncover those gaps, how we built those bridges and how we marched ahead. And then moving on from there, based on what we understood, based on what we heard, based on what we analyzed, moving on to our recommendations, which revolved around DITA in itself. And then we'll spend some time on the adoption of DITA by the three key user groups that we've actually been working with. So the leadership, the product owners or the stakeholders, as well as the writers. And then finally ending with where we are in this journey today, because this is a journey that we're still on. So where do we stand today? I'll just pass it on to KP once again for him to take you through a little bit in terms of the group itself. KP.
Yes, indeed. Always a short marketing plug for Cognizant is always good in such forums. So I'll just take a very 2 minutes to just talk to you about what our company is all about. Cognizant is one of the world's largest professional services companies. We transform clients' businesses, operating models, and technologies for the digital era. We engineer modern businesses to improve everyday life. That's our purpose statement. So we actually talk about engineering modern businesses to improve everyday life in helping some of our most established companies, world's most established brands, to remain as loved as we can for their customers. Specifically, Suranjana and I represent Cognizant Digital Business and Cognizant Digital Experience. In today's fast-changing technology landscape, our we get a lot of pleasure in working with our clients to advance every aspect of how they serve their customers, digitizing their products, creating new services and compelling experiences. So that's the business group we come from, right? So that's the quick plug that we do have. Suranjana, if you don't mind going on to the next slide.
Yeah.
So before Suranjana dives into the topic for the day, I'll probably take a few more minutes to set the broader context in terms of experiences. So when we said that we look at creating new experiences, that's the business we are in. So we are in that business of envisioning, creating, designing, and engineering amazing experiences, right? So I'll probably say that again. If you look at what we do, and our entire business is about experiences, right? Envision, create, design, and engineer amazing experiences. And note, I did not say customer experience, I just said experience, because it's probably applicable in every context of experience: customer experience, employee experience, product experience, and so on. Right? An experience also needs to cut through marketing, sales, and service, right? So keep that in the back of your mind, that everything that we do is in the backdrop of how do we really engineer or create really good experiences. Now, when we talk about experience, we quickly realize that experience, customer experience, business experience, employee experience, product experience, has multiple facets, right? It's not only about visual design. It's not just about interfaces, right? More and more, we realize that if you want to craft good experience, it is about two main things. One is content, the other is consistency. Right? And I'll say that again. Right? So two things that always come if you want to deliver good experience is content and consistency. Content is, it is the right content at the right channel at the right time, always. And then the experience should feel the same. A poor experience is when you get that product again, or when you get that service again, it feels different. That's poor experience, right? So as people, we get used to things, right? And we know for a fact that if the interface changes, or if the content changes for us, or the look and feel changes for us, even if they're trying to make it better, the experience feels not so great, right? So content and consistency matters a lot, but as far as crafting good experience is concerned. And experience is also defined by the whole product, right? Small things make a big difference, right? So packaging, documentation, delivery, all of that matters, right? And that's probably why we see the value of DITA. It kind of completes the experience that we want to create for our customers, right? So it makes sure that all aspects of experience, not just in terms of product features or visual design, but all aspects of design in terms of content, consistency, documentation, delivery, all of that is actually made really complete. Right? So that's probably why for us, if you are in the business of crafting good experiences, something like DITA or something like this framework becomes very, very relevant for us. Right? I'll turn it over to Suranjana now, who can take you through a small story of how we convince the client to go DITA, but also manage the change effectively. How did we sell the story? How did we take them through the journey? And what kind of benefits it landed out there? Right. So Suranjana, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, KP. So, like KP mentioned, we are in the business of providing those experiences to our client, and content plays a big part in that entire experience journey in itself. And that is how we got started with this particular client of ours. So, the client is one of our large clients in the financial services space. Now, they had a suite of products that was industry recognized. And the product, by virtue of being a product, had associated documentation. But the documentation that was sent out was essentially very archaic medium of the documentation in itself, and also being sent out via PDFs, via email as PDFs. Now, there was a general consensus, a general ask within the client organization as to why the documentation was being sent the way it was. And there was some stakeholders within the client organization who kind of said, okay, we have a product that's really industry recognized, but why is the documentation the way it is? They need to be much more professional. And They also received a lot of feedback from the users. And what they heard was that everyone loved the product, but they really couldn't say the same about the documentation. There was a lot of mixed feelings around that. Additionally, there was a lot of calls to the help desk as well. So in spite of a product that is recognized by the industry, it wasn't really very user-friendly. So findability of content in itself was one of the key challenges. And there were doubts also on the efficacy of the documents in itself. So we are talking about a monolithic content corpus that existed, and it existed on the traditional book-based paradigm. So it was completely book-based, focusing on the product in itself. So the need to reduce that size of the content was very strong. To use small pieces of information or micro content to convey the message was very strong. And those were the key problem statements that we heard when we went in. Now, given what we heard about the problem statement from our clients, we needed to understand and chalk out the way forward for us to be able to take our client over to the other side. So which meant having a satisfied user population who not only loved the product, but also the documentation. So we did a couple of activities. The first one that we did was we conducted a process maturity study. And what we did as part of that is that we looked at other similar leading organizations that we may have worked with in the past. We looked at their best practices that was followed, and then what we tried to do was benchmark the maturity of each component in the documentation process based on what we've seen with some of those other clients. And then we did a comparison with our clients' product content. And post all of that, we arrived at a content maturity score. And we did the mapping of the scores based on a number of factors. So the factors were like, was there a focus on the user? What does the information design even look like? What does the metadata look like? What does the taxonomy look like? Is the documentation very siloed? Is it collaborative? And as part of the research or the analysis that we did, we actually found that it was so collaborative that in some instances, SMEs would even write the content themselves and just send it over to the writers. So we did a maturity level mapping based on all of the factors that we looked at, and we plotted the maturity curve. And then we found that the documentation was between being ad hoc and being rudimentary. But naturally, there were some pockets in the entire documentation that was more mature than the others. There were certain product which had better documentation that went along with it. But overall, it was far from being optimized or managed. It wasn't even organized. And then we plotted that data against the results of the comparison that we'd done with some of the other client organizations that we'd worked with. And we found an uncanny similarity. What the results showed was that the client's overall scores, this particular client's, the overall score that they got, that was very typical of organizations who have worked with us in the past, where we've seen where they stand from a maturity standpoint. So this validates the fact that organizations such as these did want to improve the documentation, but because they had limited knowledge of the process from a documentation perspective, from a content perspective, the content of the documentation remained the way it was. Now, so that was the analysis that we did at our end. We also wanted to talk to the user base at the client end to understand what they thought. So the second thing that we did was to interview a small segment of the user population. And the expectation out of that interview was to understand what they wanted in the documentation and feedback on the existing documentation as well. And we looked at users across geographies, so we covered a disparate set of users. And then we rolled out a survey because this was a much more targeted audience. And we also wanted to understand how the documentation fared on certain aspects. Aspects like, could you get to the information very easily? Is the information accurate? Because this is a product, it comes with releases, so the need to have accurate content was very strong. But was that really the case? Was the presentation very consistent? So those were some of the questions that we asked when we did the survey. And we got a lot of mixed feelings. So some answers were, yes, we find the content, but those were also individuals who've been used to working with this monolithic content corpus for years on it. So we published the survey results and we did a SWOT analysis of the survey results. And a, a lot of questions came out of the answers that we got, and questions around the accuracy of the process in itself, the validation of the content in itself. How much of focus was there on the product versus actually being on the user? Now, once we've done all of that, we put an action plan together. So, in-depth and comparative tool analysis based on the content strategy report was one of the first steps towards moving in that right direction that we needed to take our client to. Now, we analyzed the survey results, and from there, the future direction was derived. The strategy that we would follow, that was also derived. And what would be some of the critical factors that would ensure we are successful on this journey, that was also derived. And it was at this stage that we actually started talking about DITA. And all of this, all of the maturity study analysis, the interview analysis, the recommendations on the future direction, all of that culminated in the content strategy report. The next thing that we did was we did a heuristic evaluation of the current content, and that resulted in deriving the IA. The most important part in this entire exercise was to do a content analysis of the current content. So we went through the existing documentation, existing guides, the release notes that existed. And then there were a lot of questions around the relevance of the content. So is the content even relevant? So all of those reams of content, is everything really necessary? Is there information in there that we can do without? Writing styles. Are those writing styles consistent across guides, across books? The structure of the content. There were similar types of information. Are they actually structured similarly? Or a specific type of content, was it written in a certain way? Specific templates, whether those were used or not. So these were again some of the questions that came to mind when we performed the content analysis. Findability was a big question, and that was something that we heard even as part of the user interview that we'd done. Content reuse was pretty much non-existent. It was completely a manual entry of content, given there were so many different guides that existed. So for example, in some places, in some guides, we found a line that said, click save, the details are saved. And in another document, we found, click save to save the details. It's essentially the same instruction, but written very differently. So complete manual entry of content. And that's how we kind of slowly moved towards content reuse and structured content and all of that. Some other observations also came to light when we did the content analysis. We also found that there wasn't any one single person responsible for the publication cycle. There was no one single person championing the cause. There wasn't a COE that really existed. There were definitely a pool of writers. There were technical writers involved in the entire mix, but they reported into individuals, or they worked with other individuals who weren't tech buffs. So hence the thought leadership in terms of what needs to be done with the content. So that probably wasn't there. Hence we were focusing on the process in itself. So it wasn't for us to just bring in a few writers from outside to better the documentation. It was about changing the process at the organization level in itself. And that is something that would be more sustained, would bring in the thought leadership. And we also found that the documentation was being published for various departments. So hence, there was no consistency, there was no standard. It just kind of, every time there was a release, every time a documentation needed to be updated, to be published, there was some quick updates made, and then it ran through the entire publication cycle. Now, the development itself was agile, but the content cycle, that was, a lot of it was just force-fitted, forced to kind of go along with the flow. So a lot of questions were raised around the process, the organization structure, the method of communication that was being used, and most importantly, the quality of the content in itself. The content, like we found when we read through a lot of those guides, was it was completely product focused. It was talking about everything from the product point of view, not from the user point of view. And slowly we realized that a lot of these issues was also rooted in the fact that there were a lot of non-writers in the entire mix. There was no parity in the way the content was written. There were questions around the metadata, around taxonomy. Users said they couldn't find the right content. They were PDF, they were using just a simple Control F to search for the content. There was no central portal where the content was hosted. There were probably index entries, but then only at the topic level. So hence the search in itself was not very robust. No search categories defined. So findability was a key issue. And then, of course, we asked ourselves from a delivery mechanism in itself. So should the authoring and the publishing be the same? Do we need to separate it out? And if we do, what do we need to do? So given that we understood what the problem was, we spoke to the client, we did the user interview, we did a lot of the maturity study, we came up with the content strategy document, the IEA, and we did the content analysis. Based on all of that, we came up with our recommendations. So we broke out our recommendations into technology, which is the first two that you see here, people, the third one, and then process, which is the last one. So we had recommendations around technology, people, and process. Now, DITA, like you would appreciate, it's not about just bringing in some new technology. It's not about changing the architecture. It's completely about how one approaches content in itself. It's a change of mindset. So one of our first recommendations that we had was, we said, let's separate out the authoring from the publishing. So the moment we started moving towards structured content, we wanted to separate out authoring from publishing. So we don't focus on the format in that case. We just focus on the content. And then that same content we use for print, for online help, for in-app content, even for some training materials. So we are not focusing on the format, we're not focusing on the output. And also for this particular client, there were very different kinds of deliverables that we needed, catering to different user groups. So we wanted to focus on the content in itself. The second piece, the second recommendation was around ensuring consistent content quality. So how do we ensure that? There was a style guide, but it was more of a combination of a style guide and a branding guide. So it didn't really help much with the documentation. So we wanted to enforce quality via a tool. Now again, the focus being on the structured content in itself. So ensuring that we used specific tags for specific types of content. So all content should have its own placeholder within which it needs to reside. The architecture is being enforced in that way. So we wanted to define everything. So the writing guidelines, the strategy, the linking strategy, all of that we wanted to enforce through the tool, through the standard, through which we could keep a check on the quality in itself. That was our second recommendation. The third one was ensuring that there's a dedicated COE for technical publication. So we recommended that there's a separate COE that is formed, and that should have roles like most other COEs would. So it should have an information architect. It should have a senior editor, because now if you're using DITA and the focus being on the content quality, we would look at this senior editor to go into that DITA code to check if it is aligned, if it meets the quality standards. So it's not just doing a peer review or an SME review. It's definitely much more than that. So looking at that senior editor, technical writers for sure in the mix, and some of the other roles that you would have, like a tool specialist, someone who would own production, and definitely someone who's going to be like an approving authority, someone who's championing that entire cause. And the last recommendation that we had was around setting up a systematized workflow. So we've defined all these different roles, all these different responsibilities, but how does that information move from the creation of the content to review of the content to delivery of the content to actually setting up that entire workflow. So someone should be doing the actual writing, someone should be doing the review, someone does the testing, someone does the production. So having very specific roles with very specific responsibilities in that specific workflow. And naturally, none of these roles would work in isolation. We would look at all of them working together with each of these individuals or each of these roles knowing exactly where they start and where they stop. So now we came up with all of those recommendations, but the most important thing was around ensuring that DITA was being adopted, because that is key to the success of this entire journey. Now, and these were the most critical success factors, the adoption of DITA. And the success of that entire adoption of DITA really depended on three large user groups that we were working with: the leadership, the C-suite or the leadership in itself, the stakeholders and the product owners, and the writers. Now, the first group, and the very important one, because this is the group that is actually looking at the ROI. They wanted to see the ROI. They were putting in a lot of investments that they were making. We were recommending a separate publishing tool. We were recommending teams that needed to be formed. We were recommending an entire COE. So definitely there was a lot of investment that was being done upfront by this group. But they definitely were also looking at something tangible right at the onset. So ensuring that they were on board with what we were doing was extremely important, given that they will not be able to see the results overnight. It will take time to set up. But once it is set up, strong KPIs like the bounce rate, returning customers, all of that is something that will start showing some tangible results. And hence, slowly, they will also see the return on investment. So what did we do? One of the first things we did was we kept the leadership abreast of all that was happening. So nothing actually came as a surprise to them. We had steercos where we presented the accurate picture. We had the migration plan. We drew up the entire migration plan so that every step, every turnaround time was communicated upfront. They knew at any given point in time where we were and where we should have been and where we will be in a few weeks from now. So we drew up that entire plan, excuse me, and we communicated that upfront. And of course, ensuring the documentation is part of a larger long-term vision, long-term goal, and it's not just a one-off thing that is being done. Because it's a product, it will not continue to undergo changes, and hence documentation will continue to be, will have the continuous need to be updated. So it needed to be part of a long-term plan. And we ourselves helped implement the change. So we helped this group, the leadership group, with the change management. So we had a detailed and streamlined communication plan in place, the escalation matrix in place, the RACI was clearly defined, calling out what's in it for each individual. So all of that is what we did from a leadership perspective. The next group that we had was the stakeholders or the product owners. And this was the next set of folks, and they were extremely critical to ensure success. And this set was essentially our main sponsors. And they needed to adapt. They needed to adapt to this new way and format of content. And here we are actually trying to convert a population who were very comfortable in sending reams of content via email. And it worked. To them, it worked. So this was an ongoing struggle because we needed them to essentially come out on the other side to adopt DITA and kind of be with us on the same pain as the journey that we were on. So how did we do it? Communicate, communicate, communicate. I think that is one of the biggest things we did with this group. We used status reports, we used presentations, clarification sessions on all of the whys and the wherefores, multiple daily calls, essentially for them to know it at every given, even probably to the hour, if I can say so, what we will be doing. where we are in that entire journey. Common repositories being set up with access to everyone. So all of that. Communication was very important with this group. Information about very small victories being sent out, and we've actually heard a lot of appreciation around the communication that was being done. So even if it was a tiny release that was taking place, even that being communicated. Setting expectations that the first release that you see is just going to probably be an MVP. You will not have any of the frills. The next release will have some marginal evolution. But yes, between two releases, not too much of difference. But yes, between the first and maybe the seventh release, there's definitely going to be a lot of change. Again, acting as a change champions here. Using all of the change management communication, the streamlined communication plan, all of that with this group as well, and using all of the multiple channels to communicate. And one of the important things here was, though when we started off, we weren't data experts ourselves, but based on the analysis that we did, we recommended data. So that gave the stakeholders that added comfort that in spite of not being experts, we still went ahead with data. So we acted as the change agents to transform the apprehension that they had into patronage that we see today. And definitely, there is always an underlying expectation that data will help increase that customer satisfaction, right? Because that is what it should do at the end of it. It should return, the publication costs should go down. The rate of returning customers should go up. So naturally, if we're reusing content, the capacity of the documentation team to take on additional work will go up. Hence, the time that, again, because of the reuse of content, because of all of the guidelines, the tags that we are going to be putting in place, the time that one takes to complete the deliverables will go down in the long run. Now, initially, the initial few months will naturally not see all of this because we are still kind of putting everything in place. We're working on the migration and all of that. So that was the expectation that we needed to set with the stakeholders, the product owners, and definitely with the leadership, with the C-level suite, that all of those individuals, that entire group. And that played a big part in the entire scheme of things as far as adoption goes. Now our last group, which were the writers. So coming to the writers, so how did we ensure data adoption with them? Now the writers themselves, they raised questions on the choice of tools because these were the ones who were actually doing the writing. They were very comfortable with the fact that it was going out as PDFs. There were also SMEs who were just giving content because the SMEs knew the content best. There were individual departments taking out content, publishing content based on what the release cycle looked like. So all of that. So there was a lot of questions raised on the choice of tools. There were a lot of hurdles that we had to cross. And there was a lot of annoyance as to why we were even embarking on this change. What was the need? Why do we even need to structure the content differently? Because it worked. According to them, it worked. Even today, we have writers telling us that, the content is fine just the way it is. You want to migrate, why don't you just do a lift and shift? Why do you have to put all of these other tags in place? Why do you have to ensure that there's a reuse of content? Because the content really is absolutely fine. It doesn't really need to change. So the buy-in from this population was extremely critical because they are the ones who need to adopt to data first because they are the ones who will actually need to get this going. So we started getting them embedded in the entire process. So we have daily connects where we get their buy-in. There was a lot of learning that was needed on all sides. So we attended a lot of webinars, trainings, workshops, internal brainstorming sessions, all of that. And one of the things that we needed to get across that DITA wasn't just a writing model that we were implementing. It was more of a mental model. We needed to think data. And that is what is most important when it comes to adoption of DITA from a writer's perspective. So we created a core team, we created the COE, and we actually put in that systematized workflow. We assigned roles and responsibilities, and this slot was actually empowered to find out what are the best practices that we need to use within the established data model. What are some of the content types that needs to be used for a specific topic? And as part of our daily stand-up calls, there are a lot of very healthy conversations that we have around, okay, if someone suggested a specific content type, why is that so and why not something else? And so this thought is actually now very ingrained in the entire process. A lot of thinking is happening, and of course, these daily meetings, these daily calls, this continuous connect, the continuous communication absolutely helps. And there's also a lot of clear demarcation around the roles and the responsibilities. The escalation points were clearly defined, the races were defined, and there's a clear vision in terms of what needs to get done when. There's a clear expectation setting in terms of every role knows exactly what is expected of that role. Now, also because this is a product, there's a release calendar, so kind of trying to focus on what should come first, what should come later, what is of higher priority, and ensuring that gets assigned accordingly. So what we did was we kind of went in, understood what the problems were that the client was facing in that entire documentation that they had, and they had a lot. Then doing the analysis from a process maturity standpoint to understand where they were. Then moving on to doing a user interview. So we did the analysis on our own. We came up with a score. Doing the user interview, hearing from the users what they thought of the entire documentation, where they think they want to be with the documentation. Post that, coming up with the content strategy report, the IA, doing the content analysis, questioning the very relevance of the content, the need for certain types of content, the findability of the content in itself, the taxonomy, the linking, the metadata, the structure, all of that. And then coming up with our recommendations around technology, people, process. So ensuring that we separate out the publishing from the authoring, ensuring consistent content quality, which is really key. Bringing in a COE to ensure the documentation has a dedicated TechPubs COE, and putting a systematized workflow in place. And then post all of that, working with the different stakeholders to ensure that they understand where we are, what we want to do, and we help them adopt it. We help them in that entire change management process. The leadership, the stakeholders, the product owners, and the writers. Now, multiple weeks and months of conversations with all of the key stakeholders. We collaborated with the so-called registers, the active registers. We firmed up the plan. We firmed up what we need to do. And all of this resulted in us being able to get some satisfied customers. This is still a journey that we are taking on. So some of the content matches what they were looking for. We're still in the process of DITA adoption. It started a few months ago. And we definitely can't say that we are at 100% in terms of adoption, but early signs show that there has been acceptance in certain sections. So we have been successful in certain areas from an adoption perspective. So where have we been successful? The leadership. We do have their buy-in today. They are extremely entrenched with all of our activities. They are aware of the accurate status in terms of where we are. And documentation is now part of the organization's long-term plan. It is part of the long-term plan amongst other services. It's also a core service offering that they would want to focus on in order to take not just the product that they have to the next level, but also the content to the next level. So we are also tracking, so some of that initial feedback is positive. So we are also using the publishing tool We're tracking some of the KPIs in that tool as part of the output. KPIs like the traffic on some of that published posts that we've got. The search results are a little more robust in terms of whatever little migration we've been able to do thus far. And because we're doing this one sprint at a time, so at the end of every sprint, we're ensuring that we're taking the lessons learned from the previous sprint, factoring it into the next batch of documentation that we're doing. We're leveraging the best practices, things that have really worked well in the previous sprint. We're learning from our past mistakes, and we're going from there. So it's definitely a journey that we've embarked upon. It's a journey, and it's a learning journey as well for us, while we take our client through the entire DITA landscape. And I do want to end with saying that it has been a very fascinating experience thus far. And one of the biggest lessons that we've learned is the implementation of DITA is a cycle of continuous improvement for sure, and progressive evolution. So we are on that path. We haven't come to the end of it. We have quite a few ways to go, but definitely we are on the journey of continuous improvement and progressive evolution. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suranjana.
Yep. Any questions from the audience? Happy to take them on.
Thank you so much, guys. That was the last session of today, and I think one of the most ones, at least for me, personally. Thanks a lot for that. There is one question here. Let me just publish it. What is the preferred delivery of documentation to clients if not PDF? All client employees may not have access to online documentation. That is an ongoing discussion, right? About the output formats and output channels and what to provide. May I first comment on that as an Adobe employee and then hand over to you?
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, of course, as an Adobe employee, I'm a big fan of PDF as well, and have that use case clear. I have had that conversation on so many conferences for so many years with so many people, and very often I get asked the question, should we do PDF or should we do online? And my answer is always the same. Do both. It's very simple. And one reason is exactly what you're writing. There's so many scenarios where you just want to have a PDF and you just need it. May it be that you're operating a machine deep in the rainforest without any internet and you need to have access to the documentation, or may it be that you're sitting in a plane and want to read the documentation or any kind of content actually, where you're offline. In any offline scenario, PDF is great because it provides a great experience for consuming content when you're offline. Also, it's good for archiving, for backup, to put it somewhere and pull it out only if you need it and stuff like that. So PDF definitely is a great format, and it doesn't change. It stays always the same, and you always have that possibility to search it in one go as one long document and so on. So there are a lot of advantages of PDF, and with the latest development in PDFs and what has Adobe done, with liquid PDF, and so that PDFs even can adapt to screen sizes today if they're created with modern tools from Adobe. Fully checked PDF. I call them responsive PDF. I think the official title from Adobe is liquid PDF. So there are a lot of scenarios where PDF is useful. On the other hand, customers also very often prefer having online content in a nice, beautiful, interactive online portal that you can search through, where you can get filtered content, personalized content, dynamic content, all that. And that is super relevant as well. So my take on that is always provide. We as Adobe offer all these output channels. You can publish to all of them, and why have that discussion about this or that? Why not just everything? With Adobe Solutions, you can do that. You can publish to PDF, you can publish to AM sites, you can publish to responsive HTML5 outputs, to web helps or online helps, and so on. So there are all these possibilities there. And my recommendation would be use them. Offer your clients all these channels and let the customer decide in which format, at which moment, in which context, in which scenario and setting they want to consume your content. Let the customers decide. Offer just anything. That's my take on it. Over to you guys.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with you, Stefan. So yes, it really depends on what the customer needs. There is no doing away with PDF for sure. There will always be instances, there will always be scenarios where you would need a PDF, and that is not going to go away. But there's also the need now, all the more with limited attention span, with wanting to get information on the fly, with wanting to get to information very fast, the need to have micro content, if I can call it that. And hence the need for all of these different formats, all of these different channels that exist today. So yes, but both can exist really depending on the situation and what the client wants, what the client is looking for. And, depending on that, absolutely. But no doing away with PDF for sure, yeah.
I couldn't agree more with you. Yeah, it's both, and it really depends on the scenario. Thanks for mentioning micro content and chatbots. So these are exactly the scenarios where you can use maybe even the same content that you author in one environment, let's say in XML documentation for Adobe Experience Manager or in RoboHelp. You tag the content and say, this is going into the PDF, this is going into the chatbot output, this is going into the website output, or this is going there and there. So you can tag the content with attributes, with conditions, and then you reuse that content for multiple scenarios. And we have the tools that enable you to do that, and try it out. Make your customers happy, your content consumers.
Correct, absolutely. In fact, that was also one of the things we did here with the specific client, where we wrote the content once, but multiple output formats. So, different kinds of documentation that needed for different user groups. So you write the content and then kind of put it out in various different formats. Right, absolutely.
Yeah. Good. Okay.